Hello everyone, we're going to take a look at Frederic Church today. He was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1826. He's widely considered the most important artist from what we would think of as the second generation of the Hudson River School. He was taught by Thomas Cole, who is really kind of the genesis of that school. So a lot of his early work, as we see in The Storm in the Mountain, 1847, is very similar to what we would see from a Thomas Cole. Again, this is a lot of landscapes. This is a lot of paintings that we have in and around the northern area of the United States. Again, that's where the Hudson River area painting was. But again, a lot of this is just a translation over of what we have from European art at the time, the European concept of the landscape being imbued over to the American art and kind of doing our version of it, if you will. Church is very, very famous. He was accepted to the American Academy of Design very early on. And again, this is very typical of what we have from his early work. That mountain in the background is important. We'll see it again in the next painting. But again, this is what we usually see from a landscape of this time. It's this very large open space, the horizon line very close to the middle of the canvas, showing this phenomenal sky. And then if you look very, very closely, somewhere inside of the landscape, you'll find these itty-bitty tiny people to really kind of show the grandness and the scale of the landscape. As I mentioned, there's our mountain once again, and in the foreground this time, we can see this wonderful little cottage, and as we go all the way to the foreground over in the left corner, we can see a tiny little person, and this is a great example of what I was referring to. We have this concept of the sublime, of nature and the environment being so much larger than the individual, and this is really what we see reflected in a lot of the paintings of the time. The very famous Natural Bridge from Virginia. If you live in Virginia, you will go here at least once. It's a popular destination. It's an actual natural bridge as it's formed here. But again, if we look down at the very, very bottom of the canvas, we do see these two little individuals as well, continuing this basic concept of showing the landscape. But again, the enjoyable thing about these is these are American subject matters. These are locations that we have within the United States. We can go as far as Maine, and one of the things we kind of see from Church that I enjoy is some of his work has this very sketchy kind of quality, because some of it is very much sketches. He worked in a very similar style to most of the artists of this time. The idea of painting outside is really not an acceptable thing. We don't really get to that in a large scale until we get to the Impressionists. So what he's doing is he's doing a lot of sketches, and then he's actually going into the studio and creating works from it. But some of these works that we have, these little pieces, look like he might have even kind of penned these out in the field. One of the more famous things we have from Church is actually his trip down to South America. He was inspired by a writer, a man by the name of Humboldt, who wrote a book called Cosmos, and this was this direct impetus for him actually traveling to this part of the world. And again, this is really an interesting idea. Again, we think about this closer proximity that we have from the United States to South America. And again, this idea of traveling is something we see very common in a lot of early American artists, but Church is really someone who takes it to the nth degree, if you will. And again, the wonderful thing about all of this work that he did when he was down in South America, he goes there twice. He returns there again in 1857. What we have here is, again, him doing all of these wonderful sketches and then kind of assembling these paintings of the tropics. And for a lot of people who lived in North America, specifically the United States, they hadn't seen a lot of these flora and fauna. So what he actually did, and this was a very, very clever notion, was when he returned with these paintings, he took his 4 larger canvases. We'll actually see some of these in succession here. I believe I have 3 of them for display. He set them up within the interior of a room, and he kind of did this, if you will, almost early version of installation art, where he put these very large canvases in such a way that they resembled windows looking out of the room, and he even put curtains in front of them, and he brought in some of the plants that you would see in this part of the world and he invited people to come into the space, and very much it was an experience. They would sit there and they would have opera glasses, and they would look into the paintings as if they were somehow trapped, or excuse me, not trapped, but in this space looking out. Cotopaxi, the famous volcano that we have in the background, is one of these subject matters we see him returning to again and again. So that's kind of an interesting point that a lot of people don't know about Church, is that when he actually set this up, he set it up in such a way that does kind of mirror this greater extent. We think about the Peacock Room of Whistler as being a very famous early example of installation practice. But again, we need to remember Church was kind of extending the role of the painting far beyond just the idea of the canvas. And again, that was a lot of what paintings were at the time, were these kind of windows off into another world. And again, it must have been a very interesting experience to go and see this right around 1860 or so. Looking at the paintings themselves, this is part of Luminism. This is part of the school that we have. As it says here, this famous exhibition I was referring to was in 1859. But he's part of the Luminism school, and again, a lot of this is just the placement of light. You'll notice in each of these paintings, there's a very, very strong instance of light kind of leading us in a direction. As I mentioned before, and this is an interesting example because there is actually a cross in the heart of the Andes. If you look very, very closely, and as we continue, we can see Cotopaxi erupting there in this beautiful painting. Part of the exhibition. But as I was mentioning, Thomas Cole, who is his teacher and kind of the originator of this American style, his work was a little bit more religious. And with Church, we do have this kind of transition into more the exploration of nature. It's not that he doesn't have religious motives specifically in his painting. It's just that when you compare them to Thomas Cole, the thematic of it is not quite the same thing. Again, looking at that wonderful low horizon line, but then when we look off in the distance, we do see that wonderful mountain peaking over everything, down to this wonderful water scape and this wonderful little boat, again, just using the smallness of humanity in this effect. And again, this is one of the things that shouldn't be overlooked either, is this is a method of comparison that people could use when they looked at this type of thing. They were familiarized with this type of landscape painting, so in doing this, they can get an approximation of the landscape itself and how large or small it actually is. As I mentioned, his last trip was in 1857, but the theme of the tropics is something we'll see repeated in many of his works as he continues through his life. As I mentioned, he develops this really, really wonderful sketchbook, and if you ever have a chance, do explore some of his drawings. Moving forward, so he continues to use this sketchbook throughout. We also have work done in this interim period between his two adventures down to South America. And again, this looks almost like a study, but we have kind of the similar concepts. This one in particular has a very, very low horizon line, if you will, with the sky actually being larger than the water itself. But again, when we're looking at these cross in the wilderness, another example of this very, very low horizon line I was mentioning before. Again, a lot of this is culminations of different landscapes that he's kind of putting together in his studio. And again, a lot of this is kind of his American work, if you will, in between his two trips. When we look at this, it's very hard to place this as a particular landscape. This almost looks like an amalgamation between different landscapes he might have seen. One of the more famous paintings we, of course, have by him is the very famous painting of Niagara Falls done from 1857. And again, this is an incredibly large canvas. It's one of these things where it really is just much larger than your viewpoint when you actually view it. And it's an amazing painting in terms of its realism and how well he's able to capture the water and the flow of it. And again, you can almost hear the Niagara Falls if you're familiar with it just from looking at the image. We have work done in and around Niagara Falls, again, a different image that we have from the American side. showing that he did multiple paintings of this subject matter. It wasn't just the more famous one that we are familiar with. But again, when we look at this and we look at the time period, we should be reminiscent here of the events that are occurring in America at this time.